Good afternoon and welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Audrey Lee. I'm the Director of the Environment and Natural Resource Program at the Belfer Center, one of the sponsors of this seminar, along with the Mosaba Rahmani Center for Business and Government and the Harvard University Center for the Environment. Let me make a few reminders or give you a few reminders. We are recording the seminar. We will post it on the seminar website. So if you have a friend or colleague who misses this, there will be an opportunity to look at the seminar later on. We will take questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen. Just click on it and type your questions, and then I will forward them to our speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Audrey Lee, and to welcome her back to the Kennedy School. Dr. Lee is a Senior Director of Energy Strategy at Microsoft, where she works at the intersection of policy, technology, and commercial opportunities on the Microsoft Data Center Energy and Sustainability team. She serves on the board of a number of companies, including ArcLight Clean Transition and Redaptive Incorporated, deploying energy efficiency as a service across large commercial real estate portfolios. Prior to joining the corporate sector, she had a number of jobs in the public sector, first as the policymaker at the California Public Utility Commission's President's Office, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the International Energy Agency. She was a fellow here at the Belfer Center, working on energy technology innovation. She holds a doctorate in electrical engineering from Princeton University and a bachelor's in applied physics from Caltech. I think one of the things that I was very amused when I was looking at her background, I noticed that Forbes magazine called her the Marie Curie of clean energy. So with that, it's a great honor and a privilege to welcome you back to Harvard. Audrey?
Thank you so much, Henry. Yeah, it's so great to be back. I think it's been about 10 years ago when I did my fellowship. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I thought I'd talk a little bit about our sustainability commitments at Microsoft. I joined Microsoft about 7 months ago, primarily because of how ambitious these sustainability commitments are. And then I think I thought I'd delve into specifically data centers, where a lot of our scope 2 electricity emissions are, kind of what we're doing in terms of reducing those emissions, and our vision for a decarbonized grid, and how we need to work beyond corporate commitments to how do we all work together to decarbonize our entire electricity grid. So just to start out and to give a little bit of context, the Microsoft Cloud, our data centers really do operate at quite a large scale. We have 1 million miles of fiber. We have more than 220 data centers across the world in 71 Azure regions. Azure is the name of our cloud. With more than 4 million machines and 170 edge sites. And so the team that I'm on, the data center team, is responsible for operating this cloud, and specifically I'm on the energy and sustainability team that manages the getting electricity to all of these data centers. So interconnection with utilities, we interconnect primarily at the transmission substation level, energy supply agreements to purchase electricity for these data centers, and other parts of my team work on our renewable electricity power purchase agreements and procurements to offset the emissions from all of this electricity use. Oh, there it goes, starting to light up. I find a lot of these. Oops. There you go. I find a lot of these corporate commitments a little bit confusing, X% by this year and Y% by that year. So hopefully this kind of helps frame it. But Microsoft has been, working on this issue of decarbonization and reducing our carbon emissions and just being more sustainable since 2009, when we set our first carbon emission reduction goal. And we've really made a lot of steady progress. In 2012, we became 100% carbon neutral, and we instituted an internal carbon fee across our businesses. And so with the idea that our product, the design of our product would incorporate this carbon fee, like a carbon tax, into their design and reduce the carbon footprint of our products and our services. We became a zero waste campus, got certified in 2016. I'll skip ahead a little bit. We've really been working on our scope 3 emissions. And so we've engaged with our suppliers in China in 2018. And then in 2019, we raised our carbon fee, increased it to $15. And then started working with our suppliers to implement that carbon fee for our supply chain as well. And then more on the electricity side, by 2025, we're committing to operate on 100% renewable energy, and that's additional bundled renewable energy credits or guarantees of origin in Europe. And then in 2030, we've committed to becoming carbon negative across not only scope 1 and 2, but scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in some slides up ahead. We've also committed to becoming completely diesel-free in our data centers. So our data centers use backup generators that run on diesel when the grid goes out. And so we've committed to eliminate all of that fossil fuel, diesel fuel for those backup generators. And then we have a new goal that we announced this July called 100-100-0, where we commit to 100% of our electricity 100% of the time being on zero carbon sources. And we also have zero waste and water positive. To become water positive to by 2030 means to leave
Audrey, I think you've frozen.
When we say scope 3, it's a variety of things, and I'll talk about that a little in the next slide. So scope 1, as I said, are direct emissions produced from, for different types of industries. It could be refining, manufacturing, refrigerant. Our scope 1 emissions are quite small since we are primarily a software and cloud company. But scope 2 emissions, like purchased electricity, heat, or steam, are quite large for us. So location-based, meaning the electricity. Oh.
Audrey, we lost your shared screen.
There we go.
Okay.
Does that look right to you? Okay. So as I was saying, scope 2 emissions are quite large. Location-based means the electricity where our data centers actually are and where they're buying electricity from, where they're interconnecting to the utility and buying electricity. But then once you take into consideration market-based, that's where our renewable electricity power purchase agreements then offset that electricity, and so it's quite low. And that's because of our 100% renewable electricity goal by 2025 goal is coming in. So it's quite low at only a couple hundred thousand metric tons of CO2. And then scope 3 are all the other emissions under Microsoft's influence. So supply chain, product use, and this is the largest at about more than 10 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And I think it's interesting to really understand the scale of the different scope 3 emissions. So business travel is actually quite small. Employee computing is quite small, and our downstream transportation is quite small because we're primarily software and data centers as opposed to consumer products that are delivered. But purchased goods and services, so the carbon content of our products, of all the servers in our data centers, that can be quite large. And then the use of sold products. So we actually count in our scope 3 the electricity used by all of our customers. So all those Xbox players out there and the electricity that they're using in their home, we count as our scope 3 emissions and want to be carbon negative on those as well. And then the purchased goods and services can be quite large. That's the embodied carbon in the physical materials of our products and our data centers. And we actually go down the tier as far as we can. So it's our supply chains, so down to tier 4 if possible. And so we've done a lot of work to try to be more transparent about how we're collecting that data and helping our suppliers procure renewable electricity for their operations, reduce body carbon, and also talk a little bit about our $1 billion climate innovation fund. We're investing in new technologies as well. So just a little bit more about this, the carbon tax. We believe that carbon tax fuels innovation and drives the right behavior for our company. So we've levied an internal carbon tax across our business since 2012. And we've used those funds that we generate to invest in reducing carbon emissions. So as I said, in 2019, we increased that to $15 a metric ton. And we're expanding that to more and more business units and scenarios. And so that goes into a fund that helps us pay for carbon reduction, carbon removal. We just published a Nature paper on our experience and our learning in doing carbon removal, but also water, waste, and climate resilience programs and our AI for Earth programs. And then I mentioned a little bit earlier about our supply chain. I personally think this is super impressive. So our suppliers are required to report their scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And then because we're a software tech company, we're providing that support for recording and reporting their impact, helping them increase their efficiencies and helping them switch to renewable energy sources. And so our top suppliers reduced their collective footprint by 21 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And then we've instituted our supplier code of conduct where we require emission disclosures, and it's now part of our procurement process. So I mentioned this before. We also have a $1 billion climate innovation fund that I think we started early last year. And we realized that in order to reach our goals, we need to procure existing technologies, but really do need to invest in new technologies. And the objectives of the fund are to innovate and accelerate technologies across carbon, waste, water, and ecosystems. So we need to be doing both. Existing technologies, we need to go as fast as we can, but then we're going to need new technologies as well to really hit our decarbonization goals. So we developed a set of investment principles to help prioritize our investment opportunities where we see Microsoft can be value add to the sector. And so climate impact, it needs to be meaningful and measurable climate solution by 2030. So not something that's too far out into the future. We want to be where a market is underfunded, where we can provide a benefit there. And the capital needs, the mainstream markets are not meeting that capital need. Climate equity is very important too. So when we look at investments, and I'm part of a stakeholder group, this is the rubric that we look at. So climate equity is really important. How does it serve underserved markets and communities? And then the shared alignment piece, and this is where my role at Microsoft on the data center side, how does it connect to our operations and our business and our customers as well? And so then there are areas that we've invested in, such as direct carbon removal and digital optimization, energy systems, industrial materials, as I said, about supply chain and going to the end of the supply chain, looking at things like concrete and plastics, circular economy, water, agriculture, and nature-based markets. So here's some examples of the Climate Innovation Fund funds and companies that we've invested in. So as I said, what's important to us is climate impact, but also product and customer alignment and operational alignment. And so, we've invested in companies like Climeworks on the carbon reduction side, Aclima on planetary insights. We invest in startup companies, but also in funds. So in natural resource optimization, we invest in the Emerald Technologies Fund and the Global Water Impact Fund. And then on advanced materials, Carbon Cure in 12. And then in the circular economy, we work with closed loop partners invested in Weebly. And then on the energy side, with Energy Impact Partners, VC Fund, as well as companies like AutoGrid. So that's I hope that was a good preview, overview of Microsoft sustainability commitments. And I thought I'd dive into the cloud side where I work on, and data centers, since data centers are really the largest contributor, the main contributor to our scope 2 emissions, our electricity emissions, and the work that we're doing there. So the team I'm on is called Cloud Operations and Innovation. Really, we have two goals: to make that cloud very reliable, 5 nines reliability. That cloud serves such important infrastructure around the world for many important industries, but also to make that cloud sustainable, so reliable and sustainable. And I think what's interesting about the position that Microsoft plays and the role that our team plays is that we're a consumer. We're a very large customer to utilities and consuming electricity. So we're a customer to the energy industry, but we're also a collaborator. We want to work with work with the industry in terms of policy advocacy for grid decarbonization. We want the grid to be more reliable, that as a customer and as a partner to the utility. And then third, we're an innovator, right? We're a technology company. We believe that our cloud platform, our software, our services can really help with this energy transition, this clean energy transition that we need. And I'll kind of touch on these themes throughout the presentation, but it really puts us in a very unique role to play these three different roles. And then I think our approach to decarbonization is three important things. So it's rapid. We need to go as fast as we can. We need to deploy zero carbon resources on the grid as quickly as possible with the technologies that we have today. There's no time to wait. There's no time to set longer term targets and wait for new technology. We need to do this as quickly as we can. But we're not going to get all the way there with the existing technologies that we have. And so it needs to be complete. We need advanced technology. We need to invest in the grid in order to do so. And that goes beyond what Microsoft and its own footprint is. And then lastly, it needs to be just. So when we make our investments, when we do our policy advocacy, we need to be thinking about climate equity and community benefits and opportunities in order to make this really a just transition. And so we believe that with all of this in mind, really creates this platform for climate innovation to make this transition. So just a little background on data centers. So as a consumer, as kind of sitting in the customer role, you can see the cloud efficiency over the last decade. This is a great International Energy Agency report, if you haven't seen it, that showed that over the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2020 on the left graph, workloads have increased by 8 times and internet traffic has increased by 12 times. Yet the green line on the bottom shows data center energy use has remained constant. And that is a lot of due to investments in energy efficiency. But if you look on the right, and I should add that it's all scaled to 1 is 2010, so it's all relative to 2010. And a lot of that is due to the movement from traditional on-premises data centers to cloud and to hyperscale. And at hyperscale data centers like Microsoft's cloud, you really can't get those efficiencies to keep the data center energy use flat. And we've invested significantly into that. I think we have like 12 generations of data center designs that have reduced our power usage, that have kept our power usage efficiency down for our data centers. And then on the procurement side, in fiscal year 2021, Microsoft actually signed 5.8 gigawatts of renewable energy across 10 countries. So you can see global procurement, corporate PPA procurement volumes by region on the left over the years and how they've grown significantly. This was published, this is 2021 is not quite ended yet, so it's still low. And then you can see the top corporate off-takers in 2021 on the right. This is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And Microsoft did a lot of work last year, and solar, wind, and other is load following agreements, where we're trying to match load and supply in those contracts. So our total operating and contracted renewable energy projects is greater than 7.8 gigawatts at this point. And there's a very cool website, Microsoft's webpage, where you can kind of look at all those procurements across the globe, a little bit interactive there. But we want to go beyond our 100% renewable energy by 2025 goal. And so we've been looking at 24/7 renewable energy matching. A few years ago, we piloted a platform in Sweden with Vattenfall, the utility in Sweden, to develop a first of a kind solution to match renewable energy hourly against demand or electricity load. And so going from yearly based data, our 100% renewable energy matching by 2025 is annual and global, but we wanted to go more granular and to make that hourly based data. So in this pilot, this project, renewable energy credits or guarantees of origin are time stamped and carbon stamped. And so we'll be purchasing 100% renewable energy credits on an hourly basis for our Microsoft Sweden office. And really, as I said, Microsoft plays this unique role in that where it can be a developer of these software tools that facilitate more meaningful and impactful carbon reduction efforts. But because we're such a large customer, we're a user of these services and can lead the way and show how we can calculate these emission rates in a more rigorous manner. And then we can also collaborate and advocate for that widespread publishing of more accurate emission rates. This is the example dashboard for that Swedish project that we did. So you see the wind in green, and then you can see the hydro being filled in blue. You see the consumption on different days. You can see the daily kind of load curve coming in, and then the hydro production and the wind production. And so trying to match that we did that for the Vattenfall head office and for the Microsoft Sweden office as well. So I want to talk a little bit about our new commitment that we made in July called 100-100-0. And I want to differentiate that it's both a vision and a commitment, and why that differentiation is important. So the vision is that on all the world's grids, 100% of electrons, 100% of the time are generated from zero carbon sources. And then Microsoft's own commitment is that by 2030, Microsoft will have 100% of our electricity consumption 100% of the time matched by zero carbon energy purchases. And this is this realization that Microsoft can make these commitments, but its footprint is, data centers overall, not just Microsoft, is perhaps 1% of global energy consumption today. And what's important really is that the entire grid, the world's grid is decarbonized. And so how do we go beyond just our own footprint and our own operational footprint to do more? And so, we move towards this new commitment because not all renewable megawatt hours are the same. Corporate procurement often invests in renewable energy in the wrong place and at the wrong time. When it was a small proportion of the grid, I think that was fine. But now as renewable energy becomes a larger portion of the grid mix, it's important that we're making investments in the right place and the right time. And so we want every dollar of our corporate spend to reduce the maximum amount of carbon. The end game, renewable energy is a means to an end, and that end is really carbon CO2 reductions, not how many megawatt hours of renewable energy you've procured. And so that corresponds to time, location, and marginal impact. And so you've probably seen these load curves before. You see solar producing in the middle of the day, wind being fairly flat, although on a seasonal, on a daily level, it's flat, but seasonally it can have a lot of variability. But the emissions rate for the grid can actually vary quite a lot. And so matching, investing in that wind and solar in the right time and place on the grid is important. I'll show you a few more maps to show that. Oh, and so on the table on the bottom, you can see how well solar and wind line up to that emission rate. And so clean megawatts, result in varied CO2 emission reductions, depending on the type of that megawatt hour. So you get this Rubik's like cube where you have a location on one axis, time scale on another, and then sort of a stack scale, what we call stack scale, and whether you're thinking about average emissions or marginal emissions. And so, the idea of going on the time scale from annual to more granularity, hourly and sub-hourly, and then from a locational scale from system to zonal to nodal. And so while we've made this commitment to 100-100-0, we recognize that a megawatt hour commitment is probably not enough, and that we really need to start thinking about things in terms of carbon emissions. And so we did this work with Resurety and Brattle. We have a white paper, it's published on locational marginal emissions. And it's really about reducing carbon, because reducing carbon is what really matters the most. So locational marginal emissions is defined as the tons of CO2 displaced by 1 megawatt hour of clean energy injected into the grid at a specific location and at a specific time. And so this has implications for how we invest in clean energy procurement, how we do carbon accounting, and for how we all design the power grid. So if you see on the right, we did this study with Resurety in the ERCOT grid, because that was where the data was available. PJM actually just recently started publishing locational marginal emission factors as well. But in this study, you can see the as generated locational marginal emissions in green or red. So green is better because it's more CO2 displaced for every 1 megawatt hour of clean energy you're injecting into the grid. And this is primarily due to, a lot of it's due to transmission constraints. So you can see in West Texas, putting more solar does not get you as much carbon emissions reduction, marginal emissions reduction as the green points closer to the load centers in the blue squares. And so you can see the difference in CO2 abatement across ERCOT in this slide. And just to show, we looked at specifically 2 solar plants, and depending upon the time and the location of these two solar plants, the locational marginal emissions actually can vary by twice as much. So this is, when you site that solar at a more advantageous point on the grid where it can actually get to the load, you can prevent a fossil natural gas peaker probably from firing because you have transmission constraints. And so, so really kind of we see that 2 innovations in kind of this space need to come together. I think on one side you have things like our commitment 100-100-0 and 24/7 renewable energy, where we want to reform the way we do renewable energy credits and attributes to make them more time granular and locational granular. And there are a lot of groups working on this. EnergyNet, a Danish transmission system operator, MRETS, which does RECs in the US, and several others. Whereas we also need to innovate in terms of CO2, so new CO2 metrics and offtake. And so I mentioned PJM has released locational margin emission rates. The work we've done with Resurety, Watt Time and Electricity Mat, and TCR are also working in this area. TCR actually just published a paper on this as well. And so we need to be doing both. I think the reason why we did not set a commitment on the CO2 side is because the data is just not available yet. So we need to work all together to make more of this data available so we can actually understand the marginal carbon emissions impacts of the decisions that we're making. So I just want to leave, I think we're close to time. I just want to leave you with kind of 3 big takeaways. Clean energy purchasing by corporates is very helpful, but it's really no substitute for policy if we want to decarbonize the entire grid. Corporate PPAs total more than 100 gigawatts globally, and they're primarily concentrated in the US. And thousands of firms feature renewable purchasing and science-based targets. But we really need to work on power market design, utility practices to really amplify this progress. Corporates can't do it alone. Second, new data tools really can help improve our efforts to decarbonize. So as I said before, clean megawatt hours are a means to an end. They can help reduce CO2 emissions, but not all megawatt hours are created the same and have the same outcomes for carbon dioxide emissions. And so new tools like locational marginal emissions that I impact can help us link megawatt hours to what those actual CO2 reduction outcomes are. And really ISOs, utilities, innovators, they're the key to better CO2 scoreboards. So renewable energy is largely built where it's convenient and possible, but not where it's necessary to reduce CO2 and decarbonize the grid. So how do we change markets to incentivize renewable energy to be built where it has the greatest decarbonization impact? And then purchasing 100% clean energy does not necessarily mean consuming 100% carbon-free energy either. And so better CO2 metrics can help us design the power industry. Better CO2 metrics can help us figure out how to innovate in the power industry market and how to reform our infrastructure to really get to a decarbonized grid. So with that, I'd love to take questions.
Audrey, thank you very much. We have actually more questions for you than we've had for any guest we've ever had on. Let me begin by, I'm going to come back to the whole carbon market issue and the whole issue of marginal nodal emissions. But one of the things that you've staked a lot on at Microsoft is this ability to remove carbon. And if I look at what you're looking at is sort of 4 technologies. One is BECS, one is negative emission technologies, one is reforestation, which is really not a technology, and soil carbon sequestration. And you have committed to become basically net zero in 2030, which is 9 years away or 8 years away. What happens if the technology doesn't get there? I mean, air removal is still in its infancy, and yet you've staked a lot on this. Can you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have all the answers. We don't know that we don't know the exact path that we'll take to meet all these commitments. But we're sure going to try our hardest and do everything that we can to make them. I think it's about, and this is why I've kind of reiterated this. It's about creating those markets. We can't do this alone. We can't make all these technologies. We can create funds like the Climate Innovation Fund to try to invest in this. We can work with Stripe to try to create markets to invest in carbon removal, but we can't do it alone. And this is why we're talking to people outside of Microsoft to try to do this. We're making progress. If you look at our sustainability report, we are close to meeting our 100% renewable energy goal in each year. We will by 2025, and we are taking all the actions that we need to do, like as I showed, a lot of our emissions are from scope 3 emissions from our supply chain. So we are working with our supply chain and exercising all the leverage that we can to do that. It's hard for me to predict the future. So it's hard for me to say that we will definitely meet all of this, very ambitious and challenging target, but I think we're doing everything we can to get there.
Okay, thank you. So you're trying to stimulate the market. One of the things that you also have been wanting to do is to stimulate your own behavior through a carbon tax. Is that carbon tax on all scopes 1 through 3, or is it only on scope 1? And the other question I had is that you have $15. Well, Exxon has $80. So why 15?
I don't work in the sustainability group, so I'm not sure exactly how they set it, but it has increased since 2012. I think it was lower. So we increased it to 15. And we've also, it applies to our products and our different business units, but it also applies to our supply chain. So our supply chain sees that carbon fee as well. So in that way, I think it applies to scope 3. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I guess the other one is just sort of if it does apply to scope 3, how does it work? Let's say I'm procuring, something, supplies.
So yeah, so for example, Xbox team, part of the scope 3 emissions is the electricity consumption of all of our customers that are playing with it using Xbox. And so the Xbox team is then incentivized. So they're seeing that scope 3 emissions electricity use. And so they are incentivized, and you've seen this in we've seen this in the product. They're incentivized to reduce power consumption, to create standby mode and idle mode for this to reduce it. And that carbon fee then will also help to pay for, potentially renewable energy credits to offset that scope 3 customer use of the Xbox. Is that
so $15 could be what's affordable by Xbox division as opposed to $80.
Yeah, and I think potentially the next step is thinking about how that carbon fee changes with time, right? It's probably not going to be static. It has changed in times. We revised this in 2012. So how do you kind of create a look into the future for planning in terms of how that price may change?
So Microsoft is putting up $1 billion to stimulate, innovation in this area, and got an internal tax, and has basically set probably one of the most ambitious goals of, net zero emissions 8 years from now. Why? What is it in your business plan that makes this a good step by Microsoft, or is this simply because you care about public policy so much that you're willing to do this?
I think it's probably why partly why we all care. We need to, for our business, if you take data centers to start, we need to run our data centers. We need a reliable grid. We face outages due to climate change, like many of us do. Public safety power shutoffs in California, winter storm events in Texas. And so acting on climate change is very important in terms of the reliability of our data centers, although we also need to adapt as well. And I think Microsoft also has this mission of helping our customers do what's best, do what they need to do for their own businesses. We support our customers in that way, and I think a lot of our customers also have sustainability commitments, and being able to, I had talked about that other role as innovator and building the tools to help our customers meet their sustainability commitments as well. So for example, we have a sustainability calculator, an emissions dashboard that helps our customers see the emissions impact, the scope 3 emissions from their data center usage. So for whatever Azure region any of our customers are using, they can see, we integrate with companies like Watt Time. They can see the emissions impact, the scope 3 emissions impact of their usage of our data centers. And so creating, as an example, creating these tools for our customers based on the learnings as a customer ourselves, a large energy consumer ourselves, is frankly good business. We all need these tools to make this clean energy transition, and Microsoft wants to be part of that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read this one. Can you describe the metric you use for Microsoft's energy intensity? Do you go down to the department level?
The metrics for
the metric you use for Microsoft's energy intensity. When you measure the energy intensity of what you do you basically do that at the department level or more at the corporate level?
I don't know that, I'm just looking at the sustainability report. We do that on a regional basis. I don't think we report it out on a department level. I think that's somewhat proprietary. But we do it based on revenue or dollar spend as well. So it's sort of the appendix of the sustainability report if you wanted to see all that.
One of the things that I thought was sort of really interesting is this marginal nodal emissions. So, in reality, because of transmission constraints, you may very well at times be using non-renewable energy, even though you buy more than the energy you use. So all the electricity you buy. Now it's easy to do in Sweden because they have so much hydro. But if you're bringing this to PJM or you're bringing this to other areas in the United States, do you eventually want to? I mean, because you can't move your location. You're where you are. So the goal is to try just to maximize as much as you possibly can the emission reductions for each of your facilities. You're not claiming that every kilowatt hour of electricity you use is going to be renewable, or are you?
Well, yeah. So on a time basis and on a regional grid basis, our 100-100-0 commitment does mean that if you say it's for hourly, we will be hourly matched. So our load is generally load at a data center is generally pretty flat, and so we will procure solar, wind, battery, new technologies, incentivize new technologies so that we will cover that load 8760 in a year and match that. Now, does that do much for the grid? Because the load on the grid is not flat. Even so, we will do that for our commitment. But I think the bigger question is the vision of how do we help decarbonize the entire grid? How do we get the entire grid to 100% clean energy all the time? And so I guess, there's the focus on Microsoft's own commitment, but, how do we do the policy advocacy to potentially build more transmission, to make more competitive markets, better functioning markets, so that we can get to 100% grid decarbonization. Does that make sense? There's also, I see a question in there about, why only matched energy? Why not have Microsoft commit to 100% clean energy use? And I think you touched on that our data centers are located in a certain place. It would be wonderful if we could just put solar panels on the roof of our data center and batteries and windmills. But the data energy intensity is so high, there's no way that you could cover that with on-site renewable energy. And space is often quite constrained. And even just covering our own doesn't really provide a greater good for the grid overall, right? I think the focus should be how is Microsoft contributing to decarbonizing the entire grid, not just its own operations.
I think that's terrific, and I think what you're doing is visionary and impressive. I just was trying to make the point that transmission congestion in a system does not guarantee that every electron that comes to your facility was produced from renewables, because you can't control the transmission, where that electricity goes. Over time, reduce it throughout the whole system. But I don't think it's that important. If you are making the commitments you're making, you are reducing emissions, and which I think is a positive thing. But the notion that every electron is going to be renewable has a lot to do with whatever transmission constraints there are at any given 5 minutes.
Right, and absolutely, and to your point, I mean, that's why locational marginal emissions is so important, is how are we giving everyone the market signal about, because of transmission constraints, where to build new transmission or where to site renewable energy, so that you are making the grid less fossil fueled.
Let me read this question, okay? See a need long-term for a high voltage direct current grid overlay to address seams among America's regional transmission organizations aiming towards a national transmission market where peak solar in America's Southwest theoretically could be sold to and helping to address America's East Coast during the evening peak. In other words, do you see a national grid instead of regional grids?
I think that's a wonderful dream. I would love to see that happen. I don't know how realistic it is politically. I think we should all work together to invest in more transmission in the US, to connect more transmission grids and reduce some of that congestion. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful vision. There's a lot of political reality in terms of how that might take a long time.
You want to say a few words about storage? How important is storage? For example, if you look at California, the study that was done at Berkeley, it put an enormous amount of importance on storage. If you're going to basically decarbonize the grid, particularly if you want to do it by 2035 or 2040. You didn't mention much about storage. How important is it in Microsoft's vision?
I think it's one of the tools in the toolkit. It's definitely important in terms of meeting our 100-100-0 commitment. So I think you're already starting to see a lot of corporate power purchase agreements include storage with solar and wind and hydro, additional hydro, additive hydro. But I think storage is incredibly important, but I don't think that we can rely it as the only solution. I think we're going to need other technologies in order to decarbonize the grid completely.
While we're talking about technologies, you have any thoughts on green hydrogen?
Yeah, no, and also I just want to add, different types of storage too, battery storage, long duration storage, those will all be necessary. And Microsoft sees storage both from a backup generation solution, as well as a grid decarbonization solution. And so we are already starting to switch out our uninterruptible power supplies with lithium-ion batteries, and in some places where it makes sense, making them grid interactive, and so participating in ancillary services to help the grid. And then in other places where we can get, so our backup generators are spec to provide 48 to 96 hours of backup. So they have to have enough diesel on site to provide that much backup. And so if we want to replace those diesel backup generators with things like energy storage, they need to provide that level of service. But in areas where we can get better grid reliability, the grid is so reliable that maybe you don't need 48 hours, you only need 80 minutes of backup, then we can start to think about using lithium-ion batteries for that. So storage is very interesting for us, both on a grid level, but also on site for data center backup and to replace those diesel backup generators. To your question about green hydrogen, yes, I think we have an advanced development group that is working on how we can use hydrogen on our data centers, but I think the larger opportunity is within our grid as a storage mechanism also, to get to grid decarbonization, to integrate with renewables. But I think wider, I think it's a very promising solution in the toolkit, among many other tools.
Now, you've worked at the California PUC, you've worked at DOE, you've worked at IEE, International Energy Agency in Paris. What do you think is unique to Microsoft's role as a consumer, an advocate, one of the largest companies in the world, that makes it more impactful? What makes it more cumbersome? So how is it more impactful? And also on the other side, is it at times more cumbersome than working in a policy or a public agency?
I think what's interesting, and I talked about it in my presentation, is just the many roles that Microsoft plays. But underlying it all is that technology aspect. I mean, think about all the companies, all the industries that are customers to Microsoft, that rely on Microsoft software and technology for their businesses, and using that foundational technology to help all these different industries and companies go through their decarbonization and sustainability transformation. I think that's what's exciting. Microsoft has invested in various industry verticals, really taking a customer-centric approach understanding the industries that its customers are in, whether it be, retail, manufacturing, financial services, power and utilities, energy, really understanding what each of those industry verticals those customers need, hiring teams that come from those industries so that Microsoft can create the technology that those industries need in order to do their business, but also do it in more sustainable ways. So I think that's what's exciting about working at a company like Microsoft. Microsoft also has more than 140,000 employees. And so as someone who's just joined, kind of navigating all the different projects and activities going on, it's very exciting to me, but it's a bit overwhelming too. But I've been amazed at how mission driven the entire organization is. And so even though it's so large, everyone is moving in this direction of sustainability, which is very exciting to me.
One of the big questions I think that we're dealing with is what is the role of private corporations in this whole decarbonization effort? Historically, a lot of public policy is understandably led by governments. And in some cases, the most innovative leaders now are some corporations. Certainly Microsoft would be in that group. Is this something in the long run that if we're going to meet the goals that we've set in Paris, if we're going to really decarbonize, that the role of corporations is going to be different than it historically has been because we need more leadership from them than we would have gotten under normal conditions?
I think there's still all of the different roles that need to be played. I think, Microsoft does not replace policy and government. I think it can provide its own unique perspective to help inform policy. That's what we try to do. But I think Microsoft's role really is as a large customer and providing that perspective. And then as a technology provider, I think we're definitely going to need a lot of technology to make this transition. And so Microsoft has a very important role to play there. But there's no replacing policy in this in order to get to 100% decarbonization. And then I think leading by example, investment, changing that investment thesis, showing that you can set more ambitious goals, and getting the rest of industry to work with us to get there. I think those are all important roles for Microsoft to play.
Great. My last question is a particular technology question that we've got here, which is AI going to play a role in Microsoft's decarbonization plan? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think we have our AI for Earth initiative. And I think I think what's come up in my presentation about locational marginal emissions, the need for more data, to have more transparency in there. But off the top of my head, I think some examples, Microsoft is doing some work on methane leak detection. I think, and I know that AI and machine learning is playing a big role in that. If you have limited sensor deployment and limited data in terms of where your methane leaks are coming from, and imaging of those methane streams, how do you use AI and machine learning to detect where those leaks are coming from? I think I've heard that oil companies are doing manual checks maybe once or twice a year for methane leaks, but if you can use AI to really have a better sense of where those leaks are and target them earlier, especially because of the high greenhouse gas impact of methane. That's for one example of an important area where AI will be important.
Now, we have a number of Kennedy School students on this Zoom webinar here. And I don't want to ask you a question, is that you've worked in 3 public agencies, you've worked in academia, and you have now worked for, I think, 5 companies altogether. If you add the ones you're on the board, and what you work for. What advice, career advice, would you give a Kennedy School student about the option of working on the private sector as opposed to the traditional route, which is to go into the public sector?
You know, I got to a point in government. I mean, I knew I never wanted to be in government my whole career, but I did get to a point in government where I started to doubt my own decisions because I didn't have that private sector experience, right? I was at the Public Utilities Commission and I was helping create rules for the private sector, the rules of the market, you know, how the market would work. I was working on, you know, demand response markets, and started to doubt myself about, am I making the right decisions? Because I don't know what it is like to sit in the seat of one of the participants in these markets. And so that was part of the reason why, you know, I wanted to make the switch into the private sector. So I would definitely recommend to have that different perspective. And I think being in the private sector, having had that government experience, especially in an industry like energy, where it's so heavily regulated, being able to understand that regulatory environment has been very beneficial, I think, in terms of how I've approached the private sector.
So maybe we could see you back in the public sector sometime in your career.
Yeah, I mean, public service holds a dear place in my heart. I think I would love to be a public servant again at some point in my career.
Well, thank you so much for just an excellent hour. And it's been so good to have you back, and hopefully we can get you back in person sometime when all of this pandemic dies down more. I just want to let people know that Shonali Pachori will, from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, YASA, will be talking next week on universal access to modern energy systems, development and climate opportunities. Thank you all, and thank you, Audrey. It's been great to spend time with you.
Thank you.